since I don't know what you know and what you don't know about reefs and reef fish, I started with some very general things. And well, the first thing, there's lots of different reefs across the world, as you all know. Here are some pictures of some reefs that maybe we will not be able to see in a few years from now. So where are coral reefs? You've already seen a map of the coral reefs around the world. So they are in the tropical belt, let's say between 35 south and 35 north. There are over 100 countries where you can find coral reefs. And there are millions of people who live near reefs or depend on them. And if you draw a map here of the diversity of corals around the world, you can see that there's a region which is called the Coral Triangle, where you have a much higher diversity of corals than elsewhere, and that this diversity fades as you go away from this triangle. So why are these coral reefs important? Well, you can cite a number of issues, for instance, fishing, aquaculture, pearl culture, but also natural substances. There's a lot of research going on in pharmacology, for instance, and also for industrial applications of substances found in reef organisms. There's also shoreline protection. As you know, there's probably going to be more and more cyclones and similar climatic events. And reefs provide quite a good protection. Tourism, of course. Cultural is very important in a lot of countries, especially in the Indo-Pacific. Reefs are something which is really in the culture. For instance, the last picture here is of what is called a stone fishing, which will aggregate all the people from the same community in Polynesia to catch fish. And also, coral reefs are important in the CO2 cycle. In particular, they are a CO2 sink. In other words, they absorb the excess of CO2 in the atmosphere. Okay, so what's a typical reef? So most of you probably know, but maybe some of you do not. So we can think of a typical reef with a lagoon here. Does it show? Yes. So you have a lagoon here with what we would call a fringing reef, and here a barrier reef which separates the lagoon from the outside, the ocean. And you have a reef flat, reef flat outer reef here with reef crest and reef slopes. And within the lagoon you may have some islands which are often called motus and coral bommies. So some pictures to have you see what this may look like. For instance, this is a fringing reef above and underwater. This is a motu with some coral bommies. This is a reef. These are reef flats at low tide and the same at high tide. Have a reef crest of various types, just to show you the variety of habitats you may find on reefs. And on the outer reef slope, you can have, this is in the Caribbean with sponges, large sponges, for instance, or in the Indo-Pacific. And you may have all the way to reef walls, which are nearly vertical, and a lot of diversity on these areas. So what are the major building organisms on reefs? So of course corals, as you would think. You can have branching corals, which are usually the most extensive species, but you may have all other kinds, for instance tabulate corals, massive corals, which may live thousands of years, by the way, foliate corals, and so on. You may also have other organisms which will cover and make up the reef, such as alcyonarians, gorgonians, tunicates on the bottom, sponges, in particular in the Caribbean, they're very important. On these reefs you have all kinds of invertebrates. Here are very, very few, but you have to know that there are thousands and thousands of species of invertebrates, for instance urchins, crustaceans, nudibranch, and here is a small cowrie, that's the gastropod. You have also algae and seagrasses of many kinds. There's over 1,000 species of algae which have been macroalgae which have been identified so far. So what about fish? That's what we're going to talk about today. So the first thing we need to talk about is what is a reef fish. It's not necessarily a straightforward answer. Well, there are what we could call true reef fish, which are species which will need coral to live. I mean, if there's no coral, they're not there. And then you have a number of species which are reef-associated species. They may live if there's no coral around, but they prefer. And they can be observed on a number of other habitats, such as soft bottom, seagrass, mangroves, and even in the water column. So there's about 11,000 species which live on the coasts of in the tropics. And out of these, there's about 6,300 which are associated to reefs. And out of these, you have 1,200 which are obligate reef fish, plus a number of non-reef fish. So if we look at the coastal distribution of species across the world, we do see that there's this coral triangle again that comes out as a diversity hotspot for reef fish, just as it did for corals. And you notice also that in this tropical belt here, you have about 10 times more species than you do have in temperate or cold areas. Now, what we want to do, the first thing we want to do is to know if there's any links between all these fish population across the world. So what we did is we looked at the species composition of a number of areas and we grouped them according to this. And we came out with 6 major regions, and here are the number of species for each of these regions. And you see again that it's in the middle of the Indo-Pacific that you have the highest numbers with nearly 4,000 species. But now if we look at the proportion of truly reef fish versus other fish, we see that this proportion is much lower in the Atlantic and the Eastern Pacific, around here, than in the Indo-Pacific, where non-reef fish do not represent much around reefs. If we look at endemics, so what is an endemic species? Well, it's a very wide distribution, but in other words, it's a species which is found only in one place. The only problem is how large is the place. But we'll see a little later. But if we look at the endemics versus the non-endemics, what we do see here is that in the Atlantic and the Eastern Pacific, the proportion of endemics is very important compared to the Indo-Pacific. Now, if we go a little further down, that is, these are regions. If we go to the sub-regions or provinces, we do see that the proportion of endemic, of course, collapses, but not so much in the Atlantic or Eastern Pacific, but in the Indo-Pacific, where the proportion of endemics is very low, and it's the highest on the outskirt, on the periphery of this Indo-Pacific. Now, do reef fish have any specific traits? Okay, I'm just going to look at size and diet compared to temperate fish. You can see that reef fish are, in general, smaller. There's a higher proportion of small species amongst coral reef fish compared to temperate ones. And in terms of diets, there are 3 groups of diets, or it's in French down there. So you have herbivores, which are found also in temperate regions, but at much lower rates. Detritivores, which are also found, but at much lower rates in temperate regions. And of course, very specific diets, such as fish which eat coral or sponges. Now, these species have all kinds of different functions, and we're going to go through some very specific functions and what they do to reefs. So there are a number of fish which eat coral. But actually, even though there's over 100 of those species, they are not very important in terms of their action on the corals themselves. It doesn't make much of a difference if there's lots or few coral feeding species on the coral dynamics. On the opposite, herbivores, there are lots of different types of herbivores on reefs. So here on these pictures, you see what we call macroalgae and seagrass feeders. They eat either seagrass that you have in the Mediterranean as well, and algae, large algae. You have other herbivores which are specialized in what we call turf, that is very short algae. And we have also other fish, which essentially parrotfish, which are specialized on microalgae, and they will scrape the hard substratum, as you can see here, the teeth mark on the rock. Okay, all these herbivores will keep down the algae on the reefs, and there's a competition between algae and corals. Here on this, on the picture on your left, or on your right, sorry, it's the opposite way. Around these circles you see juvenile corals growing amongst algae. So if there's too much algae, the juvenile corals will not grow, and you have kind of an inverse relationship between the proportion of coral and the proportion of algae, and the herbivores will keep down the algae and therefore allow the corals to grow. So there are many other things that fish do, in particular on reefs. In particular, they do move a lot of sediment through different ways. They can be sand dwellers, they can make burrows, they can eat the reef away, and so on. And on an hectare, it's estimated that fish will move over 100 tons of sediment a year, which is quite considerable. Now, we've seen that there's lots of fish, but can we predict the number of species there will be in one given place? So we did a model, and what is, well, for those who are familiar with these things, there's a very good correlation between what we observe and what we predict. In other words, this is the map of what is observed around the world in terms of density or diversity of fish, and this is what we predict. So how did we get to this? We had about 13 or 14 different factors that we tested, and they fall into 5 different hypotheses. I'm going to go very shortly through the first 4. The area hypothesis is that if you have a large area, you will have lots of different habitats, and therefore you can support more species. The second one, which is called evolutionary history, it means that in a given region, the species will have gone through a lot of different episodes of, let's say, warm and cold episodes or others, which will select the species through time. The third one is the energy hypothesis, and which relates the energy that the species receive, in other words, the sea surface temperature in terms of metabolism. And then the connectivity hypothesis is, well, if you go, what will limitate species going from island A to island B? In other words, it's colonizing capacities. So what you see on this graph is that the coral reef area and the evolutionary history are the major factors which are driving this diversity across the world. Now, we wanted to know how these different factors related to one another. And what we do see is that they mainly act directly on species richness. However, there is one factor, that's the sea surface temperature, which acts indirectly through coral growth. So now we're going to look a little bit into the risk these fish may endure. So in particular, well, are the endemic species at risk? Okay, so what is an endemic? So here is a few points in the Pacific where a given species is found. And we can define their geographical areas in two ways. What is called area of occupancy, in other words, the smallest polygon you can draw around the points where it is found, or the extent of occurrence, that's the largest polygon you can draw. So we'll use essentially the first one. And what we do is we define endemism as the part of the species which are found in less than 3,000 square kilometers, that is 10% of the species approximately. So on this graph, we do have plotted the geographical ranges versus the relative density of species. Each point is a different species for a given area. Okay, so and you draw a line between the 0 and 100, and you have blue and red areas. What do they correspond to? Is if you're in a blue area, that means that your endemics are, if blue dominates, means that endemics are rare, and if red dominates, it means that your endemics are abundant. So we plotted this for the Pacific, and this is what we see. And you see that in the center of the Pacific, you have the endemics are essentially not abundant. Okay, and whereas on the outside of the Pacific, on the rim, you see that there's the endemics tend to be abundant. And if you look at it a little bit differently, these are, well, this is the different places which have been put together according to their species composition. So we have here the center where endemics are rare, and on the other side you have the peripheral where endemics are abundant. And if we look at the size of these guys, in the center, what do we see? We see that the endemics are essentially small species in the center, so they're not abundant and they're small, and there is no large endemic. Whereas on the periphery, there are large endemics, and they are abundant, by the way. In terms of diet, well, it's not as much, not as nice, but there's no coral feeder which is endemic. All the coral feeders are widespread. Okay, would it be in the center or on the outside? And most of the endemics are plankton feeders. Now, if we look at the periphery, we see that essentially there is a lack of piscivores, of fish which eat other fish, in terms of endemics. So the next thing we were interested in is rare species. In the world there's thousands and thousands of species, but out of these most of them are rare. Okay, so are these rare species really important for what's going on? So don't look at the graphs too much, but the conclusion of one of our study was that the rare species, they tend to have very specific functions. In other words, they do very specific things, and more often than do common species. In other words, common species tend to do all the same thing, and rare species tend to do very specific tasks. And another thing we found out is that the rare species, they tend to belong to groups where there's only one species that does the same thing. All right? And this is just the opposite for common species. So after that, we looked at where are the threats and the protected areas of reef species. And from this, now we're going to look how this mix or matches with the vulnerability of fish. So we define vulnerability at two levels. Two levels, yes. Functional vulnerability, which is, here, how to explain this simply? You have on the vertical axis, you have the number of species you find within a functional group, and we rank those from 1 to the number of groups there is. And so what happens is there are a number of groups which have only one species, all right? And so we call those vulnerable groups. In other words, this is the functional vulnerability of a given place. And we did something very similar for species. We had what the IUCN has a species list. You all heard about the red list of species. So these are the species that belong to reef fish. We have also the endemic species, and we know the total number of species for each of these little squares here, or cells. And we can look at the ratio of those, and we call this the sensitivity of the species. Now, we do the same for the functions, and well, to make things go short. If the protection matched the problem of vulnerability of either the species or the functions, in the rare squares here, I would have some of the other little squares. But you see there, most of them are just empty. Oh, what happened there? Oh, sorry. Yeah, just a sec. Oh, wrong way. Yeah, so this means that actually there's a mismatch between what we are presently protecting and the vulnerability of either the species or the functions at present. So when fishermen go out, they're not interested in getting many species. What they're interested in is getting a lot of fish. All right? So, as we said earlier, reef fish can deliver a number of services, and probably fishing and biomass is, the production of biomass is probably the most important and the best known service they deliver. So there is a relationship between the diversity, in other words, the number of species you have on a given reef, and the biomass you find on this reef. And this relationship has limits. Okay, you see that there's no points beyond these red dotted lines. In other words, it's impossible to have a low diversity and a high biomass, and similarly, it's impossible to have a high diversity and a low biomass. Now, you see also that there's a lot of variation. The points are very scattered. So if we can understand why they are scattered, what makes them scatter, it will be quite interesting in terms of management of the biomass and the diversity. So to make it a little, well, theoretical, if I may say, here is our relationship between the diversity and the biomass. It has a given slope. And you see that diversity will reach some maximum. Okay, in a given region, you cannot go beyond a given diversity. And similarly, you'll have some kind of maximum potential biomass, which is related to this diversity. Okay, so any factor which will act on this diversity will act on the biomass, and eventually vice versa. So there's a big debate in ecology is it the diversity that drives the biomass, or is it the biomass which drives the diversity? Well, we do not have the answer. But we can consider a few things. For instance, in this square, which would be a closed system, you have some energy input and some nutrients. This will define a number of resources. And if these little symbols are species, we see that all these species use a certain resource, but do not use this one, the blue one here. So if you have a new species coming in, which is able to use this unused resource, well, you augment diversity, and there probably augment biomass as well. Now, if there are some species which, as we just discussed before, are able to change habitats or the environment. Therefore, if they come in, they will be able, if these habitats do not exist or are not used, they will be able to come in, and therefore you have an increase of both diversity and biomass. And the third thing you may see is that some species will create metabolites. In other words, they degrade what they're using, and the degraded product is used by other species. In other words, you have a kind of tumbling down system. All right, so as we said earlier, we can group species by function. And of course, as you increase the number of species, you will probably increase the number of functions. There are a number of ways of doing this, and one of the speakers will tell you much more about this later on. So, but just consider here that we have a given number of species, and that the number of function increases with it. So it could increase in different ways. In other words, here, for a given diversity, I may have a few number of functions or a high number of functions. In other words, I could go this way. Now, if there's less, if there are more functions, this means that there are less species per function. In other words, there's less competition within a function. Now, if I look at the relationship between biomass and diversity, and I have these three situations, for a given diversity, I will go we have results which show that you will go from the lowest curve to the highest. In other words, when you increase the number of functions for a given number of species, you do increase the ability of the system to be efficient. All right? In other words, you will generate biomass in some sense. Now, there are large-scale factors which do act on these relationships. So here we took in the South Pacific 2 areas, New Caledonia and Polynesia, another one which we'll not use. And what we could do is relate down here the island diversity, that's the number of species on a given island, with the local diversity, that's the number of species on a given reef, and here we took a given fixed area. And you can see that it increases. In other words, the number of species on an island are related to the factors that you see here. When these factors increase, the number of species will increase. In other words, when you increase these things, the number of species on your reef, on your local reef, will do the same thing. Now, if there's also opposite forces, that's if the more isolated you are and the less species you have on an island, and therefore, of course, you'll go the other way if you're on an isolated island. Now, let's go back to our biogeographical regions you've seen very earlier. And we could build theoretical models which relate the density to the diversity, to the biomass for each different region. And as you can see on these graphs, the length there, it's more or less long. In other words, you have a more or less diversity and more or less, and the slope of the curve is more or less inclined. And this is based on the size of species we know for these different regions. Now, in true life, this is one observation we have, for instance, between New Caledonia in blue and Polynesia in red. And what you do see is for a given local diversity, you have a higher biomass in Polynesia than you do have in New Caledonia. And this is because Polynesia is far away from everything, and species to reach that place have to be, and colonize those places, need to be large, much or larger on average than they do need to be in New Caledonia, which is much closer to the center of diversity. Now, you also see another thing on this graph, is that there are a number of in Polynesia, you never reach this area. Okay? In other words, you're species limited in Polynesia versus New Caledonia, and this means that you can reach this diversity in New Caledonia and therefore reach biomasses which are unreachable in Polynesia because of diversity reasons. Now, let's go down to the local factors. So we saw that coral cover is a factor which determines to some extent local diversity. So here suppose we have 5% of coral, 50% and 80%. And you see it's a dome-shaped curve because when there's lots and lots of coral, there's usually less diversity in corals and less diversity in fish. And okay. So if we do report this on this diversity biomass graph, we see that it's not linear. You see that, for instance, at low diversity here, you're better off if you have less coral. But at high diversity, you see that first, you cannot reach high diversity if you have low coral. And the best is when you have a medium proportion of coral in terms if biomass is what you're interested in. Now, if we look at the distance to the coast, that is, in other words, different reef types. Here you remember our fringing reef, intermediate reef, or our motu, and our barrier reefs. Okay? Now, if we look at the local diversity versus biomass, well, near the coast, we have usually very small species and a low diversity, and as you go out, you get higher and higher diversity and larger fish. So your relationship between diversity and biomass changes completely. Now, of course, fishing comes in there and does a lot of damage. So here is, suppose I have my level of, this is low fishing level between biomass and diversity. Now I introduce a strong fishing. What's going to happen? Fishermen are going to extract the largest fish first and then small fish. So there's two effects. The first effect is an effect on biomass. So that's the fishermen are getting out all this biomass. But there's also an effect, a secondary effect on diversity, which is low when you're at high diversity, but much larger when you're at low diversity. What this means is that you have actually a double trigger effect of fishing. You have first an effect on biomass and then an effect on diversity, which comes back and have itself an effect on biomass. In other words, you kill twice. Then this is a true example in New Caledonia, where in gray you have low fishing places, and in red the high fishing. And you see that for a given diversity, your biomass, of course, will be lower in the fished area. All right, and so just to conclude, because I'm a bit late, I think. Well, reef fish, as we just saw, represent one of the most diverse vertebrate assemblage on Earth. Diversity is not only species, but it's also functions. And that this diversity of either functions or species is not evenly distributed across the world. And this diversity brings in many services, among which you've just seen we've insisted on biomass. Sorry, it's threatened. There's a mistake there. Yeah, and we see also that the pressure on these fish is very uneven from one place to the other. But in order to maintain this diversity, you also saw that you have to take into account not only local factors, but regional factors and their combination. So there's no single rule to manage reef fish. You have to really be careful at not only what happens locally, but also what's the potential of your assemblage because of large-scale rules. Well, I thank you for your attention.
So let's take quick questions now.
Yes?
One variant you have not included in your lecture is the local natural predators. How do they affect the biomass and the species variability?
All right, so predators, well, we don't know so much how they affect the prey biomass because, well, it depends if there's fishing or no fishing. But what I can say is that the ratio between prey and predator is not constant in reef areas, which is opposite to what we do see in terrestrial systems. In particular, the smaller the island and the more isolated is the island, and the higher is the proportion of predators. And this has an implication because most fishermen will target predators in the first place. So when you're on an isolated island and small, you're much more fragile to fishing than you are elsewhere. That's one thing. And Alan was there, is maybe going to tell you more about it. I don't know. A little bit. So you'll probably learn from Alan a little later about that question.
Okay, thanks, Michel.
Well,
one question, sorry.
yes.
In your potential harmful effects to reefs,
Yes.
you mentioned 4 or 5 points.
Yes.
I was lacking global climate change, and I wonder what is your opinion on that?
All right. So, well, the global change will have direct and indirect effects. So the direct effects are probably not easy to measure because most fish are very adaptable to changes in temperature. On the opposite, what we do see is that corals are not so adaptable, and we do have what is called bleaching. That is corals which do have very tiny algae in them will expel these algae when they're under stress, in particular temperature stress, and when they no longer have these algae in them, they become very fragile, and most of the time they die. So once they're dead, then a lot of the reefs, coral reef associated fish are under threat. So, and after that you have also acidification, which may also act indirectly, but at present we don't know much on the potential effects of acidification.
Thank you very much, Michel.